Welcome to another episode of Wealth Uncensored. Today, I'm joined by two very good friends and colleagues, also two very brilliant tax attorneys, attorney Virginia Jeker and attorney John Richardson. And today we're going to be talking about an interesting topic. We're going to be talking about the state of the tax advisory business. All three of us have been in this business probably combined close to about 100 years. And we've seen this business develop quite a bit, probably not for the better in a lot of respects, but that's what we're going to talk about today. It seems like years ago, people really valued people that had a very in-depth knowledge of international tax laws, U.S. tax laws, whereas now it seems like so many people, because there's so much information out there, that they're trying to get answers on Google, they're trying to get answers on ChatGPT, they're calling around to as many advisors as possible, trying to utilize free consultations and stuff like this to sort of piece together do-it-yourself advice for themselves. And sometimes, quite frankly, one of the things that always shocks me is how shocked people are and offended they are when you don't want to give them your information for free, like we're a charity. To kick it off, this is kind of the topic we're going to be talking about today. Welcome to the Wealth Uncensored podcast. Straight talk about everything that impacts your wealth. In each episode, I share what I've learned through my own experience and 2 decades of helping high net worth clients structure their affairs to minimize taxes and protect their assets for the next generation. I'll also feature special guests who are experts in their own field, sharing their knowledge and experience to help you protect what's yours. I'm your host, Jimmy Sexton. Let's dive into today's show. And I think, Virginia, I'll let you start on what your thoughts are on this topic and what your experiences are.
You know, I've been practicing for 40 years now, so that's a very long time. And I've seen the development from the old school to what's now the new school with, I think, a lot of artificial intelligence in the mix. I find that people are not appreciating the in-depth complexity of U.S. tax issues. They think, oh, I saw this on Google, I saw that on YouTube, I saw this discussion, this is what I will do. And it's very superficial. Everything that I'm seeing is on the surface, unless it's a very well put together article, which people don't want to take the time to read anymore, okay? But that's where the answers lie. The answers lie in reading in depth, reading the footnotes, going to the Internal Revenue Code and saying, oh, would this apply to my situation? It's very fact sensitive, these cases. And to just be relying on the broad generalizations is a disservice to the client and really to the profession. And what I'm finding disappointing is that I'm seeing too many so-called professionals out there relying on the brevity, the chat GPT type of analysis. And I find it really an insult to the profession. But again, as I say, I've been practicing for 40 years. So I know what it's like to be in the trenches and really come up with digging for an answer and making sure you've read the IRS rulings and gee, you know, if you're not finding something on point, how do you analogize? And I think you, Jimmy, and John have also experienced this kind of in-depth analysis in all of your cases. So that's been my initial take on it. It's disappointing, it's disheartening, but I'm certainly not going to change the way I practice because it's been a great run for me for 40 years. I've never, knock wood, had an issue. And that's because of the thoroughness with which I approach my cases.
Before I kick it over to John, the one thing I would add is, I mean, as both of you guys know, I have this podcast, I have a YouTube channel. And I think one of the things that a lot of people miss is, like a lot of the YouTube videos I do, for example, I might tackle a topic and say, hey, this is, how foreign trusts are taxed, or this might be a great structure for this. But it's a generalization, right? To actually make that structure or that strategy work, you have to dive deep into the facts of the case and into the minutia of how to set that structure up, and more importantly, how to operate it on an ongoing basis. And I think this is what you're saying, and I totally agree that there's just a lot of laziness, right? People want to watch a 12-minute YouTube video and say, okay, this is what I'm doing. And that's just not how it works. It's kind of like, hey, this is possible, but the circumstances have to be right. You have to operate it properly and everything like that, right? I mean, that's kind of the basic stuff you find on YouTube and these short blogs. That's sort of the beginning point.
It's the very beginning point because, as we all know, if you have one or two facts that are different, that can change the entire analysis. You know, someone will say, oh, I didn't tell you, it's my brother-in-law who's the trustee and he's living in Bermuda and he's not a U.S. citizen anymore. But that doesn't mean anything, does it? So, you know, you really need to dig and you need to get all of the facts very clearly stated. And that's what a lot of people don't seem to appreciate.
I completely agree and endorse what both of you said so far. I think what I might add is this, that I think that what people tend to not understand is that there's a huge difference between knowing some principles of law, assuming you understand them, and being able to actually apply this stuff, as you point out, to the individual facts. Second problem, I think, runs through this is that I put yourself in the position of somebody who is beginning the process of trying to figure out, they think they might be impacted by some tax issue here. They begin by figuring out, who do they call? And I think that people don't appreciate the difference between a tax preparer, tax advisor, so to speak, right? I mean, tax preparers generally, or you give them information and they plug it into the computer, this sort of stuff, right? I mean, there's not going to be a lot of analysis, and particularly in the Americans abroad space, that's where we're all sort of living. In the Americans abroad space, when it comes to noncompliance, it seems to me that the first issue people need to determine is what exactly they should be filing, assuming they're going to file. And I've seen so many people get into trouble, right from the outset by not understanding what they should file. And I think that it's probably worth the time of all these people to begin with that question and separate that question, from who the tax preparer is or whatever, right? So, I mean, it's a tough problem. There's no question about it. And of course, people don't want to pay.
And John, I think you bring up a really important point that we should talk about next, which is the difference between a tax advisor and a tax preparer. And I'm even going to take it a step further than a tax advisor and a tax preparer, right? Because I think, especially when you're talking about the advisory aspect of it, is the importance of a legal education, right? Now, I'm not saying that there's not CPAs out there that aren't brilliant and can't do this. I'm not saying that there's not enrolled agents out there that aren't brilliant and can't do this, or people that have no kind of education that somehow self-taught themselves and are miraculously good at it. When you have a legal background, like, you're taught to analyze and interpret, right? I mean, this is what you suffer through for years, is learning how to analyze and interpret laws. And then once you do that, then you even have to go the step further. I mean, whether you went and got an LL.M or you didn't get an LL.M, you have to go the step further and still specialize in understanding not just interpreting laws, but tax regulations, right? Because what I think a lot of people don't understand is typically law school is not very tax heavy, normally like one mandatory class or something. And the other thing that I would say is, so lawyers are typically taught to analyze, interpret, and then give advice or their opinion based on that analysis and interpretation. Whereas CPAs, for the most part, don't even have a very heavy tax education, right? I mean, their education is mostly in accounting and audit, and then they have the ability to do tax, which I think a lot of people don't understand, right? I think a lot of people think that CPAs go to school to learn tax for all, and I don't think they really understand that. No, they're not really taught tax. They're not even really so much taught the analysis and interpretation. They're taught more accounting, audit, how do I report this? Even enrolled agents, they're sort of the opposite, right? I mean, they're only tax without the audit and sort of accounting aspect to it. But even enrolled agents aren't really taught very in-depth analysis. Most of it is still related to the reporting. And I always find it quite interesting that people don't really appreciate they think tax, they think CPA, when really when it comes down to tough stuff, what you should be thinking is tax lawyer, or at least, somebody with some kind of a legal background that has this training to do the proper analysis and interpretation and knows how to read the case laws.
Jimmy, what you're saying is really hitting home. I have never really encountered a CPA or an enrolled agent who'll sit and read a case. Let me go to the instructions for the tax form. Let me go to the IRS publication. Let me go to Virginia's tax blog. They are, to sit and read a case. It's almost like, no, it's anathema to the ones I've encountered anyway.
What I'd like to add to this is that I think that, if you're advising this area, I think that you need to start with what the Internal Revenue Code actually says, right, on these matters. And this may be an overgeneralization. I'd be interested in, both in your views on this, but I don't find in the world of the tax preparer that they even know what section of the Internal Revenue Code applies, let alone, what it says, right? I mean, it's just sort of, here's the manual for generally how we do this stuff. What's your experience with that, Jimmy? I mean, do you find that people say, well, the first step to understanding a tax issue is read the Internal Revenue Code? Or what do you think these people do? First of all, do you agree with me on that observation? Is my observation generally correct?
First off, I absolutely agree with that observation. And I think that the reason being is that I think if you have a legal education, you understand that everything that's out there, for example, instructions and things like that, are all somehow derived from this underlying piece of Internal Revenue Code or regulation, right? So you go to the source and then kind of, the way I would do it is work it backwards, right? You go to the code, you go to the regulation, then maybe you look at the
backwards. That's the right way to go.
That's the right way to do. That's the right way to do it, right? But I think, as both of I owned a tax preparation business for many, many years. And I'll tell you, not one of the people that I employed, and I employed CPAs and EAs that were all very, very good, but they would attack it exactly the opposite, right? They would go to the instructions, then they look at the IRS website, and then they would call me and they would say, well, what about this or that? And I would say, well, did you look at the Internal Revenue Code and the regulations? No.
Let's put a caveat on all of this, because I think this is super important. People cannot rely on what's on irs.gov. They cannot rely on the forms, on the instructions, unless whatever is said in there has been officially put into what's called the Internal Revenue Bulletin, which is something the Treasury Department puts together every year. And every year it's around 20,000 pages plus or something like this. And if it's not in the Internal Revenue Bulletin, it's not authoritative. Now, the IRS has been called into question on that because, for example, the taxpayer advocate has said, look, that's not really fair to people. The people are going to go to the IRS website. They are going to look to the instructions and the IRS publications and your FAQs. And what can they rely on? And the IRS, in its magnanimous way, said, okay, for certain FAQs, we will allow those to be considered authoritative if they're in the Internal Revenue Bulletin. And if they're not, if they're what's called a fact sheet FAQ, and it deals with a new area of law, those might also be more authoritative than others. So, it was this big, muddy mess of what you could rely on that was put out by the IRS. People have no clue about that. And unfortunately, many professionals have no clue. They'll say to me, but it was in the instructions. And then I'll have to point out to them that means zero in the world of the IRS.
But I remember, this must have been 10, 15 years ago at this point. But I remember there was some announcement by the IRS where they put out some sort of a press release or something where they basically said that, listen, you can't rely on our instructions, you can't rely on our website, and you can't rely on what we tell you on the telephone.
Exactly. In my view, what we're seeing, as John has pointed out and you have pointed out, the reliance on those things by the EAs and the tax return preparers, unfortunately, that's what they're going to. And it isn't reliable.
It's really evidence of a broader problem here, which, Jimmy and I discussed many, many times in a podcast series. The whole administration of tax laws is so complicated that, people can't understand it. They can't afford to pay people to help them interpret it. It's a real mess. I mean, I would guess that the vast majority of people who file tax returns are non-compliant in some way or another. I don't think this is like necessarily intentionally, people trying to cut corners, although I think there's a good deal of it. I think that we're just dealing with a system that's fundamentally impossible for people to comply with.
Correct, John. The system is broken to a very great extent, at least for Americans overseas or individuals with foreign interests at all that have connections to the United States. The system's broken. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I mean, try to comply with today's international tax rule. Yeah, it's frightening. And I mean, I consider myself an intelligent person. In Virginia, you're obviously a phenomenal international tax attorney. And, I know that we've both worked on cases together. And I know discussions I've had with John, who also has a magnificent legal mind, where, we sit there and discuss issues after having looked at the tax code and stuff, and we're still not 100% sure, right?
Nope.
Like we think, well, it's probably like this, but how can we know?
Well, you can know. I mean, this is a game of what I would call a defensible compliance. That's what it really is. I mean, I think the idea, since am I definitely compliant? Well, if you're somebody who is an employee and that's all that's going on in your life, I think that probably you can be 100% compliant. But once it extends beyond anything else, you're going to have trouble, if for no other reason. But, there's the job of trying to interpret how the U.S. tax code applies in areas it was never intended to apply to, right?
Huh.
And I think I'd be interested in your comments on this, but I think that the people who want to be compliant are actually being forced out of U.S. citizenship because they say, I worry about this. I don't know what to do. So I think I'll renounce. I mean, I've heard people... Yes. I know people who renounce specifically because of like Form 3520 compliance, for example, et cetera. I mean, it's a terrible problem. I mean, I think that every American abroad needs to have a conversation with somebody, an introduction. So what would my tax return look like? What would it consist of? This sort of stuff, right? Rather than just calling around and, well, I want to get the cheapest price to file a tax return and then, give that stuff to somebody. I mean, you're not in all cases, but that generally is the road to problems later.
Absolutely. And we can just add in when people try and say, well, I used a tax return preparer. I got this advice. They told me yada, yada. And they're trying to get away with IRS penalties being assessed because things were done incorrectly. The IRS is going to look to, do you have what's called reasonable cause? And that is, as we all know, not that easy to get. People think, oh, yeah, I relied on a tax professional. I should be able to get away from the penalties. But they look very closely to who was the tax professional you used? Did they have the expertise you needed? And if you are relying on some, internet-based provider that charges $400 for a tax return and you're an overseas American, I think you might have issues there.
Well,
so
I would say, unless, like John said, you are, an employee living abroad, maybe you have a bank account and your salary, take the 400 income exclusion, you file your FBAR, yes, you can probably be 100% compliant. But if you have overseas investments, if you have, overseas investment income or own any type of a foreign corporation or foreign business entity or put money into a foreign trust, I don't even think that it's possible for you to make the argument that you're fully compliant by just hiring a tax preparer, whether they're an EA or a CPA or a preparer. I almost think it's a two-step process, right? You need to get actual advice on how this stuff that you have is going to be taxed. And then you need a competent tax preparer that really knows the international, information returns and stuff like that to be able to report the things the way that your advisor told you they needed to be reported and taxed, right? And I think unless you're just this, have a very simple situation, there's no way to get around sort of having both of these pieces in order to have a chance of being compliant.
I'm with you 100%, Jimmy. I mean, I have never seen the analysis that's required. So when someone has a foreign trust, has someone actually read the trust agreement and figured out what's going on with that thing?
Yep.
Not any tax return preparer I've seen has ever done it. So it is absolutely a two-step analysis. And I mean, it can go from the extremely complicated, like you're talking about a foreign trust. Those are very complicated, or something relatively simple. And I've seen this just the other day. This person wants to give up their green card. They've held it for a significant amount of time. And we're trying to examine the prior 5 years of tax returns to make sure the person's been fully tax compliant. So as I explained to the individual, it's not just a matter of giving someone your tax returns and letting them look at the paper and what has been said. People need to ask you the right questions. Have you made gifts? Have you gotten any gifts? Who are they from? All of the stuff that we worry about incessantly to make sure our clients have been tax compliant. So in the course of this discussion, this woman mentioned, well, I have this foreign insurance with, it pays, if I die, it will pay my funeral expenses. So I said, oh, that's interesting. Well, I don't know if that should have been put on an FBAR or Form 8938. And it will make a big difference because she only has one little foreign bank account. She might not be above the $10,000 aggregate. But if we add in this insurance, foreign insurance, she will be. So we need to examine that. And the CPA said, well, send us the policy. And she said, well, it's all in a foreign language, which I won't mention. I'll have to get it translated. And it's like, hundreds of pages long. So I said, let's start off with some simple questions. Is there a cash surrender value? Can you get the money out if you want to today? Can you switch it to anything? Can you send it somewhere? To get from the FBAR to see what do we require for the initial questions, which might be answered without having to translate the policy, spend 6 hours reading it if you're a CPA, whatever. Maybe we can answer this in a more simple fashion. So trying to streamline things if you can, but again, I think you need to understand the tax law in order to be able to do that instead of jumping the gun and saying, okay, send me the 100 pages translated. So I get frustrated, obviously. I get frustrated sometimes because...
To expand on that, and I know this will get John's goat going, is, I think especially what gets really challenging too, that a lot of people don't look at, is when you start thinking about expatriation, right? And the allocation of assets between two spouses that might both be expatriating, right? When you start, or how to report them even on a tax return, who owns what, right? Well, yes. Where were they married? Where do they live now? Is it community property? Is it separate property? I mean, you can't just assume like, okay, let's say the wife earned the income. You can't just assume that that's her money and the husband and not the husband's, right? If it's a community property country where they're resident, or if they were married somewhere that says everything's community property during the marriage, you really have to drill down to that level.
I've never seen that depth of analysis with the average return preparer, enrolled agent, even with, tax advisors. They miss that. They miss it. And it's a dangerous road because if those guys get audited.
I think that's a serious problem. And, Virginia, you're saying, well, they're missing it. Well, I have a client who is, who's really forced me to drill into this. I got to tell you, it's been a bit of an education. I agree with you. There's a lot of stuff going on, definitely more than meets the eye. And that's why people who want to expatriate, which there are more and more, have got to see it as a planning process. And, as we all know, when you do expatriations, you start with a Form 8854, and then you work backwards, in terms of what that's going to look like. But yeah, the community property thing
it's very scary.
These are issues that people couldn't even imagine exist, right? It's one thing to have a bunch of things. Well, this probably matters. Let's figure matters. Let's figure it out. But the trouble here is that you're dealing with all kinds of stuff that people couldn't even imagine are relevant to U.S. tax compliance.
Absolutely.
You know,
Absolutely.
most of them, I think ignorance is bliss for a lot of them, and they just, float through the thing and nothing ever happens.
Hopefully they won't get audited, but we all
Well,
know with
yeah, but don't
expatriation.
forget, it requires a very high level of sophistication on the part of the auditor as well. I mean, the reality of this stuff is that it is, I'm not going to say beyond the comprehension because I think this can be learned, but I think it's beyond the awareness, okay, of, the vast majority of the players in this. I mean, would you
I
like to
don't
be
know,
that?
John. I'm starting to get more and more concerned because IRS now has a campaign, but they've had this campaign going for people who expatriate because they know that they can potentially earn a lot of tax dollars and penalty amounts in that group of people who've expatriated. So they're looking at the forms 8854. And I'm not going to say they're looking at everybody because obviously there'll be plenty of people they don't really care about. Okay. But there will be plenty of people that they might want to start asking more and more questions. And if there's a problem with one of those, I mean, boy, I wouldn't want to be the tax advisor that gave the advice.
Very fertile source of problems. I mean, I think we agree on that. Absolutely no question about it. And, it's an area where I think people are going to have to become increasingly careful. We've had a few, well-known cases, but these drive-by shootings are going to work their way down, to mere mortals.
I think for a long time, and I mean, I'm not just going to limit this to expatriations, right? Although I completely agree that for the most part, people that have expatriated have been pretty much left alone up until this point. But I think in general, up until now, the IRS has been so understaffed that if you file a tax return that more or less on its surface looks like, you got the 5471 there, you got the different forms there, the numbers seem to be in the right place, that they've more or less left it alone. With additional funding they're getting, AI technology that's coming into place and all of this stuff, the IRS's mandate to go after high net worth individuals, the audits of these returns are certainly going to increase. But to the point on expatriations, I think there's a lot of people that have checked that box on the 8854 claiming to be tax compliant that aren't, right? I mean, one of the things that I do with any of my clients that are expatriating is either I review their returns or I have a CPA or EA that I know really knows their stuff to review them to see if they're accurate. And I don't think that there's ever been a client that I've helped expatriate where we've looked at the returns and gone, you know what, these are right. I mean, I think every single one of them in the last 20 years has needed to amend the returns or go through some kind of amnesty or something to get
Yes.
into compliance before expatriating. I've just never seen accurate returns.
Yeah, well, of course, the way people on the retail level, right, the way the tax compliance question is asked, I think that people interpret it to mean have even filing returns. I think how many people interpret it. And of course, that's not what it means at all. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think it means perfect compliance because perfect compliance is, of course, impossible. But what I do think it means is that, significant omissions of information, returns and stuff they're opening you up for trouble. I mean, there's no question about that.
Not just income tax. I mean, people forget it's excise tax, including. So how many people have had a foreign life insurance policy and not paid the 1% excise tax?
That's
Okay,
right.
they're not tax compliant for expatriation purposes. It includes gift tax. I mean, it's beyond, like you mentioned, John, it's just beyond the comprehension of the mere mortal that these things could be impacted.
I mean, you look at it, you mentioned the excise tax on non-U.S. Policies, right? Automobile, life insurance, et cetera. I mean, I hate to say it, but with that provision on the books, none of these people have met their obligation.
You have to ask the question. A good advisor will know to ask the question, do you have foreign life insurance? Let's talk about that. Okay.
Doesn't it include all casualty, though? Automobile, car insurance as well?
I don't think it's that. I don't think it's property casualty. We'll have to look.
Yeah, I think that would be worth checking. Okay, Jeremy,
It's been a while since I looked at this, but I believe it's foreign life insurance that this applies to. Well, I
There
think
is a casualty element, but
don't think it's property, right? Like I think it's all
I don't
related.
think it's property either. We'll have to go back and
that's
check.
good news. That's good news. But
All right.
this is precisely the type of thing where I doubt very much that the omission of the 1% tax. I think that somebody probably could, claim certification because so many people miss that. But that's the reality. The U.S. tax laws impact so many different things, and you will get people from time to time who want to pay those taxes. I have not a lot of them. Okay, I'm not a tax preparer, but I have had conversations with people who are worried about that, and so they want to file and pay that 1% tax.
I've got the answer for you, gentlemen, because I did a blog post on this some time back. It applies, of course, yes, to policy of life, sickness, or accident insurance, all right? And foreign annuities. That's the 1% excise tax. Foreign casualty insurance is a 4% excise tax. It must insure against risks, hazards, etc., or liabilities within the United States. So if the foreign entity's insurance against destruction of a building located in America, that would meet the test for this kind of insurance. But if it's a casualty of a building physically located in Germany, it would not meet the test.
Well, that's
So
good news.
mitigation of the risk, yeah? I've never encountered anyone who had that issue.
It's more limited than what I thought. This is great.
Yes, one of the few things more limited than what we thought, John.
That's right. That's exactly right. Is the type of thing that nobody could even imagine would be an issue, right? It's like people think, well, I have a life insurance policy in whatever country. It must be a life insurance policy, right? Of course, it's not necessarily a life insurance policy because that is a U.S. definition, or very dangerously, and this is going on 24/7. I have something in a foreign country that's defined as a trust under local legislation, therefore it's a trust under U.S. rules. Probably not.
I think the worst ones of all time are foreign retirement accounts, right? Is it a trust? What it needs to be reported? Is it considered a qualified plan by the U.S. under a tax treaty? When I see foreign pension stuff, I don't even want to deal with it. I hand that off.
Oh, I'm with you, Jimmy. Absolutely.
Well, right now, on August 21st, they're trying to rework their regulations on this type of stuff, the foreign trust rules. And this is very much a topic of discussion. And one of the advocacy groups for Americans abroad, I think it's Democrats Abroad Tax Group, has gotten about 1,300 people to, send in comments saying that their non-U.S. pension plan or this or that is not a foreign trust. So, this is an interesting problem for sure.
Absolutely.
My personal view is they should just exempt all those things from 3520 reporting, whether they're a trust or not, and just make it easy for everybody, right? Whatever it is, we don't know what it is either, but you know what? Because it's reportable on an 8938, we're not going to ask you for a 3520, right?
Well, that would be pragmatic and mean common sense. So the IRS for sure isn't doing that.
Oh, yeah, you're probably right. You're probably right. If they do that, then that gets rid of part of their penalty base automatically. So maybe that would have to come in as a revenue off, maybe if they did that, they'd have to increase taxes somewhere else or something, to make up for the loss of penalties. What do you think?
I think that's probably the way they'd go about it. So look, I know we're coming up on the end of our time here, but I wanted to bring up one more issue with regards to the difference between really good tax advisors and people that prepare the returns and all this kind of stuff. One of the big problems that any American taxpayer has, whether they live abroad or in the U.S., but they have foreign income or assets to report, is let's assume for a second that they realize that they need a good advisor. How do they go about finding one, and how can you tell the difference between a good one and somebody that claims that they know what they're doing? Because one of the big issues that I always see, and I'm not going to name names here, but when you go out on the internet and you start looking around, there's a lot of companies whose name in and of themselves seem to indicate that they know what they're doing, right? And they're publishing a lot of blogs and all kinds of different content all day long. To the layperson, might look like, look at all this content these guys are publishing. They must really know what they're doing. And then, you look at three tax nerds like us. Virginia does a wonderful blog. She writes for a lot of publications. John, you and I have written for some great media outlets. We're not sitting out there publishing a bunch of blogs. We're usually bitching about taxes and the IRS on LinkedIn or X. What recommendation would you give to somebody on how to tell the difference between a company that's just really good at marketing and who really knows their shit?
I think that a company that would require an initial conversation, discussion about their whole situation is probably doing a good job. In other words, people really are different, okay? And to go back to my earliest point, that the starting point is, what are the forms? Like, what does this thing you're going to submit to the IRS, what does it actually look like? What does it contain? And I think that people should be having a conversation where, their lives are understood. What are their income sources, their assets, et cetera? I mean, I think that, just sending stuff off to tax preparer is going to be, garbage in, garbage out. So much of filing tax returns for Americans abroad requires an understanding of some kind of savings plan or pension type thing they have in the country they live in. I think it is completely unreasonable to imagine that a tax preparer anywhere in the world is going to have some understanding of that particular product. So I think to the extent that you can find a very good U.S. tax preparer in your country of residence who understands what your tax return in your country of residence looks like.
That's a good start. I think that's a helpful one. I don't know how easy that's going to be to achieve realistically. Okay. In my experience, I don't think it's going to be easy.
It's not going to be easy. Another question is, what is your objective in filing taxes, right? I mean, there's two broad groups: those who just want to be in compliance indefinitely, and those who are moving towards expatriation. And as Jimmy points out, man, once you're in the world of expatriation, that is definitely a heightened standard of tax compliance.
Absolutely, without question. The average person clearly does not understand that. Yep. I think a good tax professional will explain to them why this is so critical. We'll take that time. I've done this. It's not like I want to be nosy and ask you all of these questions, but if we miss out on something, it can cause you big problems later. I think the taxpayer just needs a certain amount of kind of hand-holding and basic kindness and understanding when you are asking them all sorts of questions that they must be thinking, what? I had someone, their tax organizer. First of all, is the person sending you a tax organizer? That will be a helpful hint if they're good or not. If they don't send you a tax organizer and just say, well, tell me what you earned and what you own in an email, that is not a good sign to me. I don't like that at all. I want the tax organizer. I want to see it. I want to understand the questions they've asked. So somebody was sent a tax organizer which said, do you own any foreign financial assets?
No, that's meaningless.
Meaningless. The person said no. So I, in discussion with them, said, well, look, you own a company in, whatever country. You own a company. That stock is considered a foreign financial asset. You have mutual funds in this foreign country. This is also a foreign financial asset. And they're saying, but why? This is the country I live in. Why is it foreign? It means anything that's non-US. So there's such basic information that's lacking that I think a good professional will make absolutely clear to that individual so that there's no doubt. So look for your tax organizer. If you don't have one, that's not a good sign. When you get the tax organizers, someone can look at that and tell you, is it good or not? What kind of questions are they asking? What kind of explanations are they giving you? It's not enough. Do you own a foreign financial asset? That means nothing.
But I think that, unfortunately, in this area, advertising is a little bit too effective, right? I think there's a lot of people out there doing a lot of great marketing that they're better marketers than they are tax people. And they're really sort of scratching the surface and speaking in generalizations. I mean, I think if you're looking for a really good tax professional, what you need to be looking at is not at their marketing. You need to look at, have they been published? If they have been published, where have they been published? Have they been quoted in any media outlets or professional publications or professional journals? Given any interviews? Have they litigated any, high profile tax cases that they've won successfully? Do they have any sort of recognition by their peers or professional associations or something like that? That's the type of stuff that people need to be looking at, right? I think it's sort of a two-step analysis. If you see great marketing out there, if it's published by XYZ company, worry, right? The marketing. You want to look at who the actual person is that wrote this stuff, right? And then you want to be able to do a little research on this person and see, have they been published? Have they been quoted? How long have they been doing this? How far back does their history go about talking about this stuff? I think that's sort of the first step.
Because it takes nothing to hire a marketing team. Just money, big difference between that and someone that has been out there in the trenches and publishing and producing top quality work.
The vast majority of people, particularly if they're moving down the road in expatriation, are not going to be compliant for a couple $100 a year, this sort of stuff, right? That's just the reality. I think that the truth of the matter on this is that you can say all these things, but I think most people can't afford the fee level, to really do this stuff. I mean, the vast majority of, humanity of Americans abroad are in a real mess where, they do their best. They may or may not be compliant. You just have to see where they end up. Get rid of this tax system, but we can't do that. So
I think my final thought on this, and John, I think you really hit the nail on the head there, is a lot of people just can't afford it, right? To afford a professional that really knows what they're doing, they're going to demand high fees. And they're going to have to invest a lot of time to do the work necessary to be able to give you good advice.
Somebody who sees themselves as a low-fee person, the time to do this properly is enormous. Things are difficult for Americans abroad. There's no doubt about it. But I think this has been an interesting discussion. I think an honest discussion.
So I want to thank you both for your time today. And I'll make sure to put both of your contact information in the description in case anybody wants to get a hold of you to give you a bunch of money for your expertise.
Okay, absolutely.
Thanks, Jimmy, for a great discussion.
Thank you for joining me on Wealth Uncensored, where we help you minimize taxes and protect your wealth for the next generation. If you like our show, be sure to subscribe and leave a review. And if you have any questions or suggestions for future episodes, we'd love to hear from you. You can email us at info@esquiregroup.com. And don't forget to visit Esquire Group's website for more information on how we can help you secure your wealth. I'll be dropping knowledge again next week. Don't forget to join us.